I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Kelsey Bolar. Kelsey Bolar is a Senior Policy Analyst at Independent Women's Forum. She is also an editor of Bright, a morning newsletter for women by women, a contributor to The Federalist, and a senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute. She is also a contributor at the Daily Signal. She is a frequent guest on Fox News, Fox Business, and was featured as a speaker on the 2018 CPAC panel, #US2, Left Out by the Left. Previously, Bolar worked for the Daily Signal and the Heritage Foundation as a senior writer and producer. There, she co-hosted the weekly podcast Problematic Women, produced videos that received millions of views, and regularly appeared on radio and TV. Bolar graduated from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, daughter, and Australian Shepherd, Utah. With so much being said in media and popular culture about women's wages, Kelsey is here to set the record straight. Please join me in welcoming Kelsey Bolar.
I was invited here today to speak on the myth of the gender pay gap. But I am actually here to tell you that in some cases, not only is the gender pay gap real, but after having children, it's something that women should consider leaning into. Let me start off by telling you a bit about myself. After graduating from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, I landed my dream job as a production assistant at Fox News headquarters in New York City. I was making $12.50 an hour, trying to survive, living walking distance to my job, because I needed to be there quite often, including on many weekends. Fun times. After doing that for nearly 2 years, I arrived at the conclusion that in order to really pursue my dreams, I had to leave the flashy Fox News headquarters and move to Washington, D.C., where I could see how the sausage is made, as they say. I needed to really dig my hands into policy and politics and understand how things work on the ground here. I ended up finding a job that was my perfect mix of my interests and backgrounds. As a reporter for what was a new startup at the time called the Daily Signal, it hadn't even launched yet, the multimedia news organization of the Heritage Foundation, I did a mix of multimedia reporting, video production, written stories, podcasting, Facebook Lives were just beginning at the time, and eventually on-camera media appearances. I happily worked there for, I believe it was around 7 years, until having my first child. Now, when I got pregnant, I did not plan on making any career changes before or after her arrival, but as they say, a baby changes everything, and you just don't know what you don't know. After she was born, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I decided I could not leave her for an office job all day. I just couldn't do it. So I decided to make a trade-off. Less money for more flexibility and time at home with my daughter. I did this by leaving one organization for another that was structured very differently so as to enable moms to do this. Independent Women's Forum, where I work now, is quite special in that regard. But the other option I had, aside from sticking to my 9-to-5 job or fully walking away, I could have proposed a pay cut and to take on more of a part-time role. On paper, me asking to do this could have been bad for the organization. In an effort to avoid bad press, businesses and corporations and organizations alike are pressured to have the same number of female employees as male employees working at the same salary. But let's be real, in today's environment, it's probably more safe for them to have more females than males. There's also what I think, to some extent, is a legitimate desire to have a diversity of employees in terms of sex, gender, and backgrounds. And around Capitol Hill, if any of you have interned here, you probably know it's not that uncommon to be the only female in a meeting. I had worked my way to a decent mid-level position But now I was asking to pull back from that. In other words, I was asking for a pay gap between myself and my male counterparts who still wanted to work a full-time job after having their own children, and maybe even then some. I'm not ashamed or embarrassed to tell you that I took a significant pay cut for more time and flexibility to spend with my daughter at home. I'm proud of it. I think that in many cases, mothers should not only consider leaning into the gender pay gap, but in some cases we have an obligation to. Our kids are more important than our careers. In her book, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters, one of my favorite books for any mom to be, highly recommend writing it down, even though for a lot of you that probably won't be for a little while. Psychoanalyst Erica Rossimer writes about the importance of a mother being emotionally and physically present in the early years of children's lives. Although the science is hard to hear, I recommend this book to every mom to be. It documents the science behind the fact that during the first 3 years of life, gives children, documents the science between the fact that being present during the first 3 years of life gives children a greater chance of growing up emotionally healthy, happy, secure, and resilient. In other words, the author writes, when it comes to connecting with your baby or toddler, more is more. Not every mother has the desire or the financial ability to work part-time or take a step back during these early years, but we should praise, not shame those who do. Unfortunately, our female empowerment, girl boss culture does the exact opposite. It makes women feel guilty for following their maternal instincts and temporarily or permanently taking a step back. But that doesn't mean that some brave women still are. Right now, we have a record number of jobs available. I'm sure you've all seen the help wanted signs everywhere. A restaurant owner just this week pleaded with President Joe Biden about his policies that are disincentivizing people from coming back to work. But still, millions of Americans are declining to go back, and I think their reasoning is more complicated than the media is necessarily giving them credit for. Since COVID-19 began, 2.5 million women have dropped out of the workforce, including 1.5 million working mothers. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have called the situation a national emergency. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo told Fortune that businesses and policymakers are underestimating the size and magnitude of the problem. But with so many jobs available for the taking, is the decrease in labor participation rates amongst women a problem, or could it be the reflection of a choice? If women really want jobs, they're out there for the taking. Job openings hit a record high of 9.3 million recently, but still, even with incentives, companies can't find enough people to fill them. Coupled with expanded child tax credit payments of up to $300 per child that hit households this month, pandemic relief aid is undoubtedly disincentivizing women and all Americans from returning to work. Add that to the uncertainty the pandemic brought on parents' ability to sign their children up for summer camps, enroll them in daycare, send them back to full-time in-person learning, and the simple desire to enjoy summer after an incredible difficult year, you can see why it's understandable that so many women are choosing, for now, to stay home. But what I'm personally watching for the data to show is whether there's another more permanent shift happening among women. Most media headlines choose to focus on the negative effects the COVID-19 pandemic had on women. Just survey examples, such as the New York Times, America's mothers are in crisis. To NPR's, "This is too much. Working moms are reaching the breaking point during the pandemic," and the Washington Post, "The pandemic is devastating more than a generation of working women." Stretched thin, trying to be parents, educators, and remote employees all at once, moms did have difficult jobs and faced burnouts on multiple fronts. But behind the chaos, many moms discovered the joys of spending more time with their children. The pandemic served as a catalyst for a lot of parents to try homeschooling or other less conventional education models. The percentage of households with school-aged children homeschooling doubled from the spring of 2021 to the fall of 2021, from 5.4 to 11.1%. Compared to March 2020, in April 2021, people who said they had a more favorable view of homeschooling as a result of the coronavirus pandemic jumped 9% from 55 to 40 to 64%. And this is not just happening amongst your stereotypical white Christian evangelicals. The number of Black families homeschooling also skyrocketed to double digits during the pandemic from a mere 3% prior. Surrounded by lockdowns, death rates, and a heck of a lot of uncertainty, Americans searched for meaning and purpose during this pandemic. And many of us realize that nothing gives us more meaning and purpose than having children and raising them at home. And the beauty of that is that it's good for children too. But as the saying goes, time is money, and when women choose to spend more time at home, there's also the consequence of them making less money. And when those changes are reflected in the economy, politicians, economists, and media personalities write them off as a very bad thing. In some cases, women can't work due to a lack of employment opportunities. But it's long past time for us to reject the premise that women earning less is universally a bad thing. For many, it is a blessing. Now let's talk about the real myth behind the gender pay gap. The raw wage gap that you often hear discussed in the media regarding the gender pay gap is not a measure of equal pay for equal work. The raw wage gap is simply a comparison of averages. The often cited statistic from the Department of Labor that women earn 80 cents on the dollar that men make does not compare women and men in the same profession who work the same hours with the same qualifications, experience, and talent. The wage gap is not driven by widespread discrimination either. On average, women work fewer hours and in lower paying professions than men. Women also tend to work in safer and more flexible work conditions and take longer leaves of absence from work due to childbearing or other caregiving responsibilities. Wage discrimination is already illegal in the United States and has been since 1963, when the Equal Pay Act was signed into law. The 1964 Civil Rights Act also protects women from harassment and baseless gender discrimination in the workplace. This isn't to say that sexism or bad bosses don't exist, but discrimination is already illegal. On Capitol Hill, during the past few years, you probably heard about a piece of legislation called the Paycheck Fairness Act. The left claims that this piece of legislation will close the wage gap. The Paycheck Fairness Act would change the legal system to encourage more lawsuits and increase government oversight over business compensation decisions. Men and women often have different priorities when it comes to work and family, and there is nothing wrong with that. We empower women to make the best decisions for their careers and personalize by providing information about how their earning potential and work schedules will be affected by the different decisions they make. We shouldn't ignore the reality that the majority of women value flexibility to some extent and enjoyment over their job salary. To borrow a term from Sheryl Sandberg, we should lean into this. That's why equal salaries really aren't the best way to measure men and women's success. A better measurement of success is whether men and women are free to pursue happiness on their own terms. This may result in unequal outcomes on paper, but the statistics tell us those outcomes are broadly the result of choices people make, not discrimination. The goal shouldn't be to get rid of the gender pay gap, but to make sure that women and men are offered with equal and plentiful opportunities in the workplace and in our economy. In order to debate this issue, which many of you will, it's important to know one central fact. After controlling for factors such as work experience, career choice, time out of the workforce and school, just a 2% gap remains. This isn't, I said this before again, this isn't to say that sexism or bad bosses don't or won't exist, but the so-called gender wage gap is hardly there. And again, discrimination is already illegal under 2 federal laws: the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, let's look into a real-life case example of a gender pay gap claim that I'm sure many of you have already heard about, especially with the Tokyo Olympics kicking off today. All right, tell me if I'm pronouncing her name wrong. In March, Megan Rapinoe, or is it Rapinoe? I meant to ask somebody before I started the speech. In March, Megan Rapinoe, the gold medalist and 2-time World Cup champion, complained to Congress and President Joe Biden that she and her fellow USA women's soccer teammates were victims of pay discrimination. HBO Max happily amplified this claim in its new documentary, as did pretty much every major media outlet. Unfortunately for Megan, the only court of law to rule on the matter found her claims pretty empty. In 2019, the soccer player and her teammates sued the United States Soccer Federation in California federal court, seeking more than $66 million in damages for alleged wage discrimination and discriminatory work conditions. The court found sufficient evidence to allow the players to proceed with their claims of unequal travel and hotel accommodations, medical support, training, and other support services. But it dismissed the players' claim of discrimination, finding that the women's team earned more than the men's team on both a cumulative and per game basis. As it turns out, the women's national soccer team earned approximately $24 million overall. The men's national soccer team earned only $18 million. Only. The average take-home pay per game was over $200,000 for the women's team, and the men's team was over $8,000 less. And while the individual female plaintiffs made an average of $11,356 to $17,416 per game, the 4 highest paid male players made an average of $10,360 to $13,964 per game. But those facts didn't stop the new Victoria's Secret models case. I'm sure you all saw that. Megan and her teammates then argued that even though they did receive more money than their male counterparts, they were nevertheless still victims of discrimination. Why? Because they would have earned even more had they been paid under the men's structure, which offers higher bonuses. Now let's remember, the collective bargaining agreement for the men's team is an incentive-based pay-to-play contract under which only players who are selected for training camps or particular competitions have a chance to earn bonuses. The court found that the women's team, in fact, rejected an offer to be paid under the same structure as the men, instead opting for higher base pay and greater stability in the form of yearly salaries paid irrespective of training camps attended or games played. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Women are known to be less risk takers. We often opt to take security. Both teams negotiated their own pay structures. My question is, how about taking some personal responsibility for these choices that the women's team made? Late last year, plaintiffs in the U.S. Soccer Federation settled the unequal working conditions portion of the case, with the federation agreeing to provide the female players with travel arrangement, hotel accommodation, staffing, and venues on par with male athletes. This is good for the women's team. They deserve it. But that's not the narrative that the media is still telling you about the story to this day. In April, the players appealed the case in the trial court's pay discrimination ruling to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, pressuring the U.S. Soccer Federation to mediate the baseless claims ahead of the Olympics. And just a few weeks ago, 13 Democrat senators sponsored a bill to withhold federal funds from the 2026 FIFA World Cup unless the U.S. Soccer Federation increased pay for the women's team. If enacted, the legislation called Give Our Athletes Level Salaries Goals Act, they love doing things like that, would prohibit funding for the U.S. Soccer Federation, FIFA, and for host cities and state or local organizations assisting with these events, which is set to be hosted by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Sorry to be blunt, but what a joke that the media, corporate America, politicians, and Meghan herself continue to peddle these lies in light of the federal judge's findings. I can't help but wonder if this is sincere ignorance or conscientious stupidity that so many people go along with this lie without acknowledging the basic facts about the case that the court found. That the different pay structures the women's soccer team negotiated and agreed to are the result of any discrepancy in differential pay between the men and the women's soccer team. And by the way, count Victoria's Secret as complicit in this lie too, using fake female victimhood to sell its awful products. Tell you, Third Love sells much better bras. While the U.S. women's soccer case appears to be built on lies, some of you will sadly experience injustices in your careers, which is why, unlike some of my conservative colleagues, I am a bit more remiss to dismiss all of the girl boss, female empowerment messages. As someone who lacked self-confidence in my early years to stand up to bad bosses and negotiate a raise, I needed the encouragement that some of these messages provided. But looking back, I can tell you for sure that a good mentor would have been a far better route. But don't confuse injustices with inequalities. As women in the United States, we are amongst the most privileged and equal women in the world. We'll face fights throughout our careers, and a tiny fraction of you might face true gender pay discrimination. The good news, however, is that the laws are on your side. We have a legal system that, with evidence of a discrimination claim, you can and should win. Not to mention, the mere threat of legal action is enough to scare companies into giving you a raise. But I didn't say that. Feeling like a victim is not empowering. Women convinced their workplace is inherently sexist may feel unnecessarily resentful of their bosses and male colleagues. This can discourage women from seizing opportunities before them. At some point, businesses and corporations are going to have to wake up to the reality that men and women make different choices in their professional lives. This fact also exposes the ridiculousness behind gender quotas, and in some cases, the inherent dangers. Earlier this year, United Airlines tweeted, "Our flight deck should reflect the diverse group of people on board our planes every day. That's why we plan for 50% of the 5,000 pilots we train in the next decade to be women or people of color." This begs a question United still hasn't answered. If a male pilot has more experience than a female pilot who met United's admitted standards, will he still be hired first? Or will the job go to the less qualified female to fulfill its gender quota? As of now, passengers on United Airlines have no assurance. In addition to prioritizing identity politics over basic safety, the quest to fulfill gender and racial quotas in hiring decisions undermine the very employees United claims it wants to help. Race and gender quotas signal that women and minorities cannot reach lucrative positions without special treatment. This actively undermines the hard work that many of us put in to achieve our goals and undercuts the confidence that we actually earn these positions that we hold. It cheapens our achievement by creating a sense of tokenism. When boarding the flight, does any qualified pilot want passengers to question whether they're flying this plane based on how they look? No. Female and minority pilots alike want to be hired because they can fly a plane, not because they can fulfill United's diversity portfolio. Cheapening the qualifications, skills, and experience of women and minorities by engineering equality of outcomes is a dangerous pursuit, and one that will have the unintended consequence of keeping all of these groups grounded rather than helping them soar. The path for all of your careers to take off and soar will look different. At times, your gender could be an asset, while at others, it may feel more like an obstacle. Fight if you need to fight. Find a good helper, find a good mentor to help, and remember that the law is on your side. But stand firm in rejecting any notion that you're a victim, unless you truly are. And finally, as a mother of an adorable almost 2-year-old and a second baby on the way, here's my personal advice. If and when you eventually have the blessing of becoming a mom, consider leaning into the gender pay gap. I can promise you won't regret it. So I came to ARB with lots more data and statistics on the myth behind the gender pay gap. Happy to go into any of that more, talk more about my personal experience in this area, or really any career policy or politics questions you might have. In the back.
I was just curious what you see the future being with this idea of the wage gap, because you see over and over places that are raising the minimum pay for their workers are just lowering their hiring. So is this idea that's being circulated of the wage gap actually going to make it harder to hire women because employers are now going to have to pay women more to equal that?
Certainly this could impact both men and women in their ability to hire. When talking about the minimum wage, we have to remember the real minimum wage is zero. If a job doesn't exist, there is no minimum wage to make. And that's precisely what will happen if we continue down the path of government spending, over-regulating businesses, and inflation, which is causing restaurants to increase their prices, which will drive customers out, which, in addition to having to pay their employees more minimum wage, will leave them in the position of having fewer positions to fill. That's bad for anyone in the modern workforce. And I also think on this issue, it's important to remember that women do make different choices in terms of the professions they pursue. I have to dig it up in my notes here, but men are accountable for well over 90% of workplace injuries. Women don't choose to pursue those types of professions, and given their risks, of course those professions should be paid more. There's a reason women occupy more of the lower wage, housekeeping type hotel professions, things of that nature. We are far more risk averse And I do think a lot of that has to do with our maternal instinct, our, you know, lack of desire to take as big of risks as men, as seen reflected in the example I shared about the men's and women's soccer case. I mean, the men's and women's teams, it actually reminds me of the Taylor Swift case, where she negotiated a contract that it turns out she didn't like. And most of us reading that contract through the lens of today are like, yeah, that's a horrible contract. That's taking advantage of her and her music. She deserves rights to this. But we also have to remind her that she negotiated this contract. And perhaps she was young at the time, but she should have had better counsel. And we all have to take responsibility for our actions and not just blame victimhood. We all have personal autonomy, and we need to practice more personal responsibility.
Well, first of all, I just want to also thank you for your time today. I come from a household where my dad chose to stay home instead of my mom. My mom's been the breadwinner. What do you think about families that choose to have their fathers stay home instead of their mothers? And do you think the growing number of fathers staying home will help to eliminate that 2% gap that's possibly there still in the wage gap?
I certainly applaud any father who chooses to take a step back from the workforce to care for their children. My younger sister just got married, and she's already thinking how it's going to work out for her family, because she too is the breadwinner between the two of them right now. Of course, things could change. But, you know, for a lot of, we need to acknowledge for a lot of different reasons, women can't always take a step back from work. And in a lot of families' cases, you're absolutely right that the woman makes more than the man, and it would be a big financial change for the family, for their lifestyle, to switch roles, and perhaps the mom gets far more personal fulfillment from her job than the dad. And so absolutely it makes sense to give and take in that regard. I guess, you know, the one hard truth that I try to share with people is that there are biological differences between men and women. There's a reason that women are actually the gender to give birth, and our bodies physically have the ability to provide for babies at a young age. We don't have to. You know, formula is a great option. I use some of it myself with my daughter. And, you know, not saying that women physically have to be the ones providing for their children all day, but the research does say that there is a difference between mothers and fathers, and it's during those first 3 years that those differences have the biggest impact. And so if you're ever going to make a temporary adjustment in your career, my advice would be, I mean, of course, absorb all the science and statistics that you can. Maybe we'll find out something different by the time y'all are having children, but those first 3 years matter in terms of forming healthy, emotional, and stable children, and mothers being physically present. It has a big role. What I love about the book that I recommended to you all, I'll remind you of the title, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. What I love about it is that it presents these hard truths, but it also presents realistic options. And it goes so far to break down the number of hours. Like, studies have looked at the number of hours that moms have been away, and she gives the advice, I think it was around 20 hours a week, that seem to have no significant statistical impact on the baby's outcome in those first 3 years. More than that, you do see some differences. I'm a firm believer, though, that if that child is loved by a mother, father, caregiver, if they're truly loved, they're going to be okay. You're not doing anything wrong. I just think that we as women need to be honest with ourselves about what science and statistics does say, and if and when it is possible during these early years, maybe it just means keeping your full-time job, but being firm with your employer. I leave at this exact time every day, and don't push me on it. You don't want to push me out of the workforce. I want to be here, but during these early years, I need these hard boundaries. And in addition to that, I've written about this for Independent Women's Forum. One of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic is more flexible work options for both men and women, but this is particularly good for women, and this is something that should unite so-called feminists both on the left and the right. Unfortunately, the policies being pursued by the Biden administration could reverse this. Just yesterday, there was a hearing on a piece of legislation called the PRO Act, Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And this would force a bunch of independent contractors or freelancers to be reclassified to full-time employees and subject them to joining unions and returning back to that more traditional 9-to-5 workplace, where we know from polling that women prefer flexibility, and many of them choose the freelance flexible work position because it gives them the ability to do both. I mean, I did not give up my career in the least. I'm pleasured to be here with you all today. I just changed I changed the physical arrangement so I wasn't physically leaving my daughter all day. And again, I do pray that long-term impacts of COVID-19 means that you all will have much more flexible work options than you did prior to this. Companies were forced to realize that it is not the end of the world to let employees work remote. And you might not like working remote. I actually, when you're young, I would not proactively recommend it. But it is such a blessing for those early years to physically be able to be present with your child, but not leave them all day. So my hope is that women will have more choices because of all this mess.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. I just wanted to ask about, well, you talked a lot about negotiation and contracts. I just wanted to ask, what are your tips and strategies when we can negotiate a salary?
Yeah, this is something I've had, I'll share my own personal journey with. Making $12.50 an hour and needing to live in New York City was not easy, but it was my first job out of school. And quite frankly, I will say to this day, I was not in a position to negotiate. I had to prove myself that I was worth more than that. Now, this is my experience with a bad boss. After a year of working there, I had my review, and I actually, I was hired as a production assistant, but I ended up, when I said, sometimes your appearance will be an obstacle, sometimes it'll be an asset. I no doubt have been judged on my appearance in different times throughout my career, for better or for worse. And in one example, I started working at Fox News as a production assistant, working on ads and promos and things of that nature, more on the news side. And my boss, who was this tall, little chubby man, came to me one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to put you on Fox News Magazine. You're going to write and produce lifestyle content for us." And on one hand, I was like, amazing. I am just out of college and I can be published with my name on foxnews.com. Absolutely, this is amazing. And quite frankly, I'm sure my appearance had something to do with that, because I was clearly a young woman who enjoyed fashion, food, fitness, and things of that nature. And so he said, go for it. But on the flip side, I was like, there is nothing in my background that reflects an interest in these things, besides what you're seeing visually. And I did feel judged negatively in some regard, that I wasn't perhaps being taken as seriously as I wanted to be to move into more of the policy and politics world. So there are two sides of that. On one hand, I could get published on foxnews.com, and I did, and that's what I ended up doing for probably a year when I was there. And I was working alongside women who were in their 30s, and we were like posting recipes and fitness videos, and my content was just like blowing them out of the water, because they were posting content like how to make delicious Brussels sprouts, and I was like, the cheesiest, gooeyest mac and cheese ever. Obviously, my content won. Life is about balance, and I still love mac and cheese to this day. So I was doing that, and I was doing it really well. My content was performing, and it wasn't always just mac and cheese. And when I had my review with a guy who didn't have like a close watch on me, I guess, I had a glowing review about, my content was performing so well, and we are going to give you the maximum raise that Fox News gives out at these reviews. Oh, sorry, I probably shouldn't say their name, but it was, like the 8% raise, or maybe it was even 12%. I don't remember what it was, but it was pretty much the highest percent I could have got. I was terrified. I mean, mind you, I'm like a year out of college, lacked any of the confidence you see today, but I looked at him and I was like, sir, do you know what a 12% raise is on $12.50 an hour? And he looked at me like a deer in headlights, and clearly didn't even take the time to look at what I was even making at the time, because most people were on salary. But as someone who was just hired, I was hired at $12.50 an hour. I was like, you're not even gonna put me on salary? How about we start there? And that was about all I could say or do at the time to stand up for myself, because again, I didn't have a mentor. I didn't know who to go to talk to about this, and I was very intimidated at this massive corporation that I was still honored to be working at, and I didn't want to jeopardize anything. But luckily, I did come to my senses a little bit after that and realized that I need to move to Washington, D.C. to really do what I want to do. And I don't regret that, and I actually think it's funny looking back. I know a lot of the management and executives have these little TVs in their office, and sometimes I do just picture him sitting at his office working and then seeing my face on Fox News. Gives me a little bit of pleasure. So that was like that reflects my inability to really stand up for myself early on in my career. But what I did at my next job, when I always think you need to negotiate your salary off the bat, but like you don't have too much leverage at your first job. After you prove yourself, you do have leverage, and I really like the process that played out at my last role, because I went to my boss and I said, here's what I want to be making. How do I get there? And he proposed that we write, we made a Google Doc with goals. Here are the numbers that I need to meet, of the articles I'm publishing, the video views I need to get, and things like that. So I knew exactly what I needed to do from my end to get to where I wanted to be, and we had a very transparent process, and it totally worked out. So I would actually recommend proposing an option like that. I had a great boss when I was when I asked that, who was the one to propose. We kind of make a goal sheet that if you hit these targets, then I'm going to fight for you to get that raise. But not every boss is going to say that. So my recommendation is perhaps to propose that to a boss, to say, can we come up with a list of goals, of targets I need to meet in order for me to get to this place in my salary where I want to be.
So as young women who are going to be looking for jobs within the next few years after we all graduate from college, what do you recommend we look for in an organization if we think that motherhood is in our future? So if we possibly do see ourselves like scaling back the hours in a few years. And then kind of a part two to that is, do you find it difficult to kind of make sure that you were maintaining the same, like you had the same amount of respect after you chose to scale back to part-time after becoming a mother?
I think it's always flattering in an interview process to tell, if this is true, to tell your employer that you can see yourself with this organization long term. You're looking for a career, not a job. And because of that, you want to ask questions about their flexible work policies, whether they do allow remote work under certain occasions, such as motherhood. It's tricky because you don't want to walk into an interview and come off as if like you're about to have a baby in a couple months, especially if that's not true. You might be far off from that. So I quite honestly, like transparently, wouldn't walk in and specifically ask about their policies for new moms. I think it's something in the compensation package, certainly with maternity leave. If you have any questions about their maternity leave policy, do not be afraid to ask that because they're handing it over to you in writing. But the remote flexible work, I would just make that more of a lifestyle question. I think with everything that just happened, it's perfectly legitimate, and actually companies have had to transition to that to compete for good employees, because so many of us, I mean, whether or not I'm doing it because I have a child or not, I mean, it's so nice to be able to, you know, drive somewhere on a Thursday night and work from home from a different location, and employees just want that. I mean, it's just not necessary to be physically tied to an office all day anymore. So I don't think anybody would be surprised or taken aback by a question of flexible remote work. In terms of maintaining respect, I don't, it depends where you are, first off. If I did that at the Heritage Foundation where I was before this, I think there's plenty of people in that building who would have respected me more for prioritizing my family. But of course, that's a conservative policy organization, and many of you will pursue jobs, you know, in corporate America, which doesn't exactly have the same values as us. I do think that women have to accept the trade-offs that come with taking a step back from work, whether that's part-time hours or working remote when the majority of the rest of your colleagues are not doing that. I had a colleague who worked remote during the year she had 5 children. She did it pretty quickly, so it was maybe like 7 years total that she worked remote. But, you know, she would tell you that she did face some consequences for that. You know, she felt that she was skipped over for a big promotion. And on one hand, I have a lot of sympathy for her. But on the other hand, I was personally willing to take that pay cut. I was willing to face those consequences. I think we need to really think through what we're signing up for, and if we're willing to do that. You know, especially when it comes to putting boundaries on and saying, I'm not going to be available during these hours. It is going to be hard when, you know, your male colleagues and the rest of your female colleagues who are not doing this at this time, it's going to be hard when they're available and you're not. And there's going to be consequences for that. I hope nobody gets treated unfairly for that, but my advice is that a lot of these consequences you could face are worth it for that extra time with your family.
I have the last question. I think in today's world, it's very scary to just see everything going on. So what would your advice be to those who are like young conservative women who like are seeking to like have a traditional family and like to, you know, upkeep society by doing that, but also, you know, are good conservative voices and are competent women and can go into the workforce, and like how to balance that, and if you should choose one, which one to choose, or kind of balancing maybe off of the last question, like what to look for.
I mean, this is something I'm thinking through and struggling personally with to this day. I have to make a decision about school soon for my daughter. I grew up going to public school. I never thought twice about it when I was younger that I'd be sending my children to public school. But now, for so many reasons that I probably don't need to explain to any of you here, I'm really questioning that if it's safe to send her to a public school, and that has huge implications on us and our lifestyle. I mean, private school isn't free. We need school choice, so everybody fight for that. But I do think we have to make some of these hard decisions, and that might mean readjusting, parts of your life. Like, I never thought I'd ever consider homeschooling. I doubt I'm gonna do it, but like the fact that I'm even considering it kind of shows you where we are today, and how if family is your number one value, you have to be willing to make these types of sacrifices. But I think that early on in your career, you're all gonna be walking into your first job soon. You feel like you don't have much choice, and quite frankly, you don't, because you don't have the leverage to negotiate for these flexible work arrangements, higher salaries and so forth. But with hard work and proving yourself, you absolutely can and will get to that position. Maternity leave policies are only getting more generous, but it's actually funny. I have friends who work at American Express. She gets at least 6 months of paid leave for having a child. And on one hand, I look at her, I'm like, oh, I'm so jealous, that would be amazing. On the other hand, I look at her and think, you're going to have to go back to work full time, commute back into New York City, and your employment structure is not as conducive to flexible work. And so, given my relatively short paid time off policy versus hers, I would absolutely want mine. The ability to have long-term flexibility, work from home options. And I think these are all choices that we as women need to think through in our lives as we further our career and do get closer to the point of having children. And just I'd assure you that by then you'll have much more experience in your career, and you will have much more leverage to negotiate the type of work-life balance that you probably hope sitting here today you might one day have. And my situation is great, but I'll tell you, I still struggle with it. Like, I work from home, but I still feel like I don't get to spend enough physical time with my daughter, and I'm always thinking about, well, should I rearrange some things? Should I check some of my priorities? It's evolving, and you need to be open-minded and most importantly, honest with yourself, and reject the culture and anyone around you who makes you feel guilty or shamed for having the values and priorities that you do. That doesn't mean you always have to be the conservative standing up for your beliefs in the workplace or in your personal life or at the family table, but it does mean you need to be honest with yourself about what you want and make decisions not to please everybody else, but what you know in your heart is right for you.